Hey, all you ethic cuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Tuesday now at noon Eastern. If you think fixing our workplace can fix your world, and if you think getting an MBA can help you do exactly that. So we are about to kick off session 3 of our Ethicsverse MBA. We've got so much great feedback from you guys about it, so we're going to keep moving forward. Today, we're going to be talking about connecting compliance to corporate strategy. This is one of my favorite sessions. I love corporate strategy. There's so much opportunity in it. So as we get started, drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat, connect with one person today, at least tell us where you're coming in from, and maybe share some of the takeaways from the earlier sessions. What you'll also notice as I run through this, as you're dropping all these links in and stuff like that, what you'll also notice is that Joa and the marketing team put together a takeaway, kind of a summary for the last 2 sessions. You remember this is session 3 of 6, some takeaways from the last couple of sessions because it's been over a month since we connected. So download that and download and kind of link into some of these other resources where you're of course here going to get some credits for HRCI and the compliance certification board and for SHRM. And we're also going to be giving away 5 copies of Reed Blackman's Ethical Nightmare Challenge. So we are keep these emojis coming. Okay. I'm by myself today. I'm feeling a little lonely. It's rainy here in Charlotte. So I'm going to need something to keep me moving forward. So get your comments in the chat. Talk about how, ask some smart questions and earn yourself a book. We're giving away 5 of those today. And if you have not downloaded the benchmark report, that's also available on the console. So you definitely want to download that, share that with your team, and use that over the next couple of weeks in your weekly stand-ups and spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about a particular session or a section in the benchmark report. There is a ton of great information in there, a ton of great tactics for you to improve your program. Another great way to improve your program, if you feel like your investigation process is dialed in and your intake is dialed in, you're probably wasting a lot of time on policy management. So there's this huge velocity gap on the policy management operation that we've tried to address with Policy Plus. So this new platform is going to help you to really compress the time from drafting to publishing and give you much better visibility into whether people are actually reading your policies and if they actually comprehend it. So here's a little commercial on that, quick 60-second commercial, which you're going to love.
Your policy program has a lot of moving parts. Ethico keeps them all in view. Every approval, every attestation, every deadline in one dashboard. Start a new policy, and before you type a word, Ethico checks whether it already exists. Build it your way. Upload, write, link, or choose from a template library. Define your properties or let AI autofill to save you time. It reads your document and suggests the metadata for you. One click to save, straight to your policy library, a single source of truth for all your internal documents. Find anything instantly, even if a keyword is buried deep inside a document. Keep it organized with custom categories and nested folders. Filter by anything, owner, department, status, and more. Ready for review? Send it. Reviewers are notified immediately. Configure your review process, set deadlines, and ensure nothing falls through the cracks. Every audit trail, version history, and acknowledgement report is ready for you to export the moment you need it. One platform for every policy, every approval, every attestation. Ethico, love your work.
If you have not checked out Policy Plus, now is the time to do it. So go to ethico.com and fill out a form, and somebody will be in contact with you, or drop a 1 in the chat and someone will reach out to you immediately. You don't even have to lift a finger. You asked for it. It's coming back. Last year, we had a record-breaking Ethicsverse Day, the biggest ethics and compliance event in the history of the world. We're coming back, and we're going to try to double it this year. So we have 4 phenomenal sessions, 12 CEUs, a bunch of great speakers, and a bunch of great insights on July 23rd. So circle your calendars, take the day off, invite your friends, and it's going to be an event that you don't want to miss. The sign up for that is open now. So now is the time to go ahead and sign up for that on July 23rd. You're going to be hearing a lot about it. This is the last time we're going to be talking about this Compliance in the Age of AI conference. I'm hopping on a plane to fly to Boston this week for this phenomenal conference. So much great thought leadership. AI is the thing everybody is talking about. And this conference is not going to disappoint. So if you're going to be in Boston, or you want to hop on a train and shoot over to Boston, use this code Ethico50 for 50% off admission. And I'll be back next week to give you some takeaways, some of my biggest takeaways from the conference. All right, here is me, your favorite professor for your MBA. We got a lot to cover, so I'm going to dive in. I'm going to talk fast. If I'm talking too fast, go watch it on YouTube at 50% speed or something like that. So we are We're talking about strategy is not a spectator sport. This is session 3 of 6. So we're going to be talking about today, how do we connect our compliance program to the strategy of the organization to elevate ourselves from this cost center that's apart from the business to being a true part of the business, integrated and really helping to reduce the risk in the organization as a means to the end of improving the enterprise value of the organization. So we have 6 sessions in this Ethico or Ethicsverse MBA. We've talked about how to understand the business you're in. Those were some real basics, some nuts and bolts. Last session, we talked about how to speak better or how to better speak the financial language of the business. And today we're going to be talking about connecting the business to, or connecting compliance to the business strategy. Next time, we're going to be diving into revenue and marketing and talking about how to navigate that revenue engine. So you don't want to miss any of these. If you've missed any of the ones in the past, definitely go to the YouTube channel, like and subscribe, of course, share with your friends. But you can find all the replays of our podcast, the Ethicsverse and the Ethicsverse MBA there. Okay, so quick pop quiz. What are your company's top 3 strategic priorities this year? Go ahead and drop those in the chat if you so choose. The next question, the real question, is how do your initiatives, how does your program plan for the year connect to those 3 strategic priorities? If you can't answer that question, you're probably spinning your wheels, but luckily, you're not alone. You're at the Ethicsverse. We're talking about how to connect our program to the strategy of the organization. And I think our inability to do that on an ongoing basis across the industry that we're in, or across, the economy that we're in, leads to these problems that many of us feel in our departments, where we don't feel like as connected to the business, where we feel like there's a lot of impact or there's a lot of wasted effort or perspective left on the table. So this is the reason that compliance keeps getting left out of the room. So we need to figure out ways to connect our efforts and ensure that our efforts, the things that we're doing, are connecting to the business objectives. Those are changing all the time. So we're going to get down to strategy 101. We're going to talk now in this section about vision, mission, and strategic objectives. Okay. So this is not corporate fluff, okay? It's very easy for these things to turn into platitudes. And in some organizations, they really are merely platitudes. They're merely words on the wall. But I think for organizations that take these things seriously, these are animating concepts that end up driving the behaviors inside the organization. So the vision, this is where we're going. This is the North Star. If you're climbing a mountain, this is the star at the top of the mountain, the next summit that you're climbing toward. The mission, this is why we exist, okay? This is the path that we're going to take up the mountain. This is the purpose that defines what the organization does. I guarantee you the board, or at least the executive leadership team, the CEO, they have a clear picture and a clear vision for where this company, where your organization wants to go, and that purpose for why the business exists. The strategic objectives are those road maps, the map on how we're going to actually get there. This is your 3 to 5 year goal that really shapes the resource allocation in the organization. Every business, every department, every business, they have a set amount of resources. Those resources are limited to some degree, and those need to then be allocated. We're always talking about on the Ethicsverse making better bets with our time. Time, of course, is a resource that we all that we have to sort of allocate. The business itself has all these other resources, dollars, plants, assets, machinery, all those different kinds of things that are allocated in pursuit of this organization's mission, ultimately to achieve that vision. The operating plan is like, what are we going to do this year? What are our OKRs for this year or for this quarter? What are the annual priorities that are mobilizing and animating the decisions that the business is making in order to achieve its goals and its objectives? I know some of this stuff is basic. Buckle up. We're going to be going a lot faster. So why does strategy matter to compliance? Well, I think first and foremost, if you don't understand the strategy, you don't understand what the ensuing risks are that are likely going to spur out or grow out of that strategy. So every new market, every product, every partnership is inherently going to bring new risk exposure that compliance should have on the risk surface that it's considering, right? The strategic decisions tend to happen fast. Businesses move very, very, very quickly. Speed is the number one strategy for every business, right? The velocity of business sometimes goes faster than we can keep up with. But as these decisions are happening fast, if we're not plugged into that decision-making process early, we're just going to end up living in reactionary mode. Let me get some emojis if you've ever felt like you've been living in reactionary mode. And if you have, and we're going to be talking about how we can get a better seat at the table more quickly so that we don't spend the rest of our lives playing catch up. That's not how anybody wants to live. So compliance teams, like I was just saying, are reactive because we're not plugged in or we're particularly reactive when we're not plugged in to that strategic planning process, okay? Strategies, the execution of any strategy ends up creating compliance risk because things are moving around, okay? So we need to understand that is really the catalyst or the driver for new risks is the execution of that strategy. So the closer we can get to that strategy, the more we can articulate that and again, connect our efforts to those business objectives, the more likely we are to move from this reactionary mode into a proactive mode where we're actually adding enterprise value to the organization. So let's talk about Porter's 5 forces. If any of you have friends that have taken MBA courses, or if you've, if you've read, Harvard Business Review in the late 70s, then I'm sure you're very familiar with Porter's 5 forces. So what this concept is a way to sort of map the competitive landscape of an organization. So these 5 forces are competitive rivalry, the threat of new entrants, buyer power, supplier power, and the threat of substitute products. So let me run through these very quickly, okay? So let's talk about competitive rivalry. So what this is this is the intensity or the aggressiveness of competition among existing players in the market. So the drivers for competitive rivalry are like number of competitors, industry growth rate, the extent of differentiation or commoditization across providers or products in the space, and the existence of low or high barriers to entry. If an industry has really high barriers to entry, let's say it's a pharmaceutical company or something, the competitive rivalry is going to be a lot lower than, let's say, a pressure washing business that all you need is a $200 pressure washer from Lowe's or from Home Depot. The second one is the threat of new entrants. So what is the likelihood that a new competitor is going to easily enter your market and start taking away your market share? So the key drivers of this, again, are the barriers to entry and things like economies of scale, high capital requirements, government regulations, or strong brand loyalty. There's so many examples of high barriers to entry. Again, if there's higher barriers to entry, then the threat of new entrants is going to be significantly lower. It's very easy for me to, buy a tent and start selling tomatoes or selling cookies at my local farmer's market. That's a very low barriers to entry market. That market, cookies at a farmer's market, has a high threat of new entrants. Now let's talk about buyers and suppliers, okay? So the bargaining power of buyers, what this really is talking about is the ability for consumers or clients to put their company under pressure and drive prices down. So if buyers have a lot of power, then they have a disproportionate impact on ultimately the price that your organization is able to charge for its product. So the drivers are a small number of dominant buyers, low switching costs, and the availability of similar products. Okay, so if there's only a couple of buyers of your product, then those buyers, if you're a supplier of seats for airlines, there's not that many airlines. So those buyers have a disproportionate level of power than somebody else that's maybe like a gas station. Like a buyer of a gas has very low power on the price of gas, okay, in isolation. And so powerful buyers, this is kind of the high risk bargaining power of buyers. An example is, powerful buyers demanding better quality, lower prices, where they're forcing competitors to fight for their business. So think about the government as a buyer. The government usually has significant bargaining power as a buyer, and they can do a lot to influence their suppliers because they're kind of the only game in town and they have, a big budget to spend. On the other side of it, you have bargaining power. This is the fourth of these Porter's 5 forces. So this is the power of suppliers. So the ability of suppliers to drive up prices on raw materials or reduce the quality of goods and services that they supply. So the key drivers here are where there's few substitute suppliers or highly specialized materials, or there's really high switching costs for a company. So the high risk example here is if a powerful supplier can squeeze profit margins by starting to hike their prices, knowing that the company has nowhere else to go. If you hear about, highway robbery, that's usually a situation where there's one supplier who can charge a lot for a thing, i.e. Las Vegas, okay? The threat of substitute products is the fifth, and this is one that gets overlooked a lot. So what this is the likelihood of consumers finding a different way or a different product that's going to fulfill those same core needs that your business is providing, okay? So when Netflix first came out, Blockbuster didn't think that they were much of a threat. They didn't see them their offering as being a real substitute for the products that they were selling, those tapes that they were renting. Fast forward a few years, all of that content was delivered via the internet, and the threat of a substitute product totally skyrocketed. Now I think there's like one Blockbuster left, okay? So the key drivers for the threat of substitute products is favorable price to performance ratio of the substitute, i.e., the Netflix example. The easy availability. Again, Netflix is a great example, and low switching cost. Halting driving to Blockbuster every single Friday night, and instead just pressing a button on your television makes those switching costs extremely low. That's not a big change for somebody to move over to streaming. So the high risk is when substitutes place a strict ceiling on the prices that the company can charge. And if the prices are too high, consumers are going to switch to an alternative. And think about high price in the context of a relative pricing, okay? So how do these intersect with compliance? So, we seek, let's go to this slide. What each force means for your profile, let's run through. Actually, let me go back to this one and run through it, okay? So how these things show up from a compliance perspective. So let's talk about competitive rivalry. When there are price wars or there's margin pressures, these are going to lead to corners being cut on compliance. You guys have all probably lived through this at various stages throughout your career when the economy goes down or when there's a stiff, there's tons of competition going on. People start to kind of cut corners and take shortcuts. When competitors start to cheat, there's also a pressure for our organization to follow suit, okay? Supplier power. When there is a supply chain concentration with a particular supplier, that creates disproportionate third-party risk. Okay, we saw this a bit during the COVID era, right, where we saw all that fragility in the supply chain. Fewer suppliers means greater dependency and less leverage, less buyer power, you as a buyer, relative to those suppliers. Buyer power is when, again, customers can demand. Buyer power demands can sometimes create bespoke compliance needs. So perhaps you have, think about, again, selling to the government. The government can place tons of compliance requirements, bespoke needs on your organization in order to just sell with them. Whether that's certain certifications, whether it's certain forms that need to be filled out, all those things are added costs, essentially on a sort of total cost basis. Those are all added costs in doing business with that supplier, okay? Or with that customer, I should say. The threat of new entrants. So when sometimes regulatory barriers are the moat to your business. There are some businesses like banking, for example, there's a ton of regulation necessary that you have to comply with in order to be a bank, right? So there's certain regulatory moats that exist around certain industries that can kind of stave off the threat of new entrants. Compliance expertise in these kinds of industries, then it's easier to kind of make the case for the competitive advantage that compliance can bring to a business when those barriers to entry are high, particularly when they're rooted in things like a regulatory moat, like I just alluded to. And then finally, regarding threat of substitutes, disruption can create a regulatory gray zone. So think about, Robinhood, or think about all of this crypto trading. There's a big gray zone around that where nobody knows where the sort of regulation applies. And yet people are voting with their feet. Consumers are voting with their feet and trading assets on some of these other platforms. So when new technologies and businesses can kind of outpace the regulations, that creates more compliance uncertainty for various businesses. So what these things mean for your risk profile, we're going to talk about rivalry, suppliers, buyers, new entrants, and substitutes. So with respect to rivalry, you want to monitor competitor enforcement actions. That's going to give you some clues about what regulators really care about in your industry. They're going to signal where they might be looking next and help you get ahead of the curve. So if a competitor of yours recently had an action taken against them, that's a clue for you to look within your own program to make sure that everything is buttoned up and those trains are on the tracks. If you can map your supply chain concentration and start to assess third-party compliance maturity, that's going to give you some indication on the extent to which suppliers are able to squeeze you as a buyer of their products. With respect to buyers, if you can map your risk profile relative to buyers, I think it's smart to track consumer-driven compliance demands and build them into your program. So again, if you are selling something to a bunch of organizations that are always maybe you're a software company and there's always security assessments that need to be filled out. Well, U.S. compliance can help to automate that process and sort of aggregate the questions that are asked over and over and over again to, again, increase the velocity of sales for that sales team. And finally, for substitutes, what kind of disruptors might be entering your space, and what kind of regulatory response might be coming, right? There's a lot of clues, a lot of things rhyme across different industries. So what kind of clues can we use to anticipate and, again, help our organization see around the curve to make compliance a more strategic competitive advantage or more of a strategic lever in the organization? So we need to remember that every competitive force creates this kind of compliance pressure. And if you can map these forces, then you can predict the risks in a much better degree. Again, we're trying to move from this reactionary mode that many of us spend 80-90% of our time in to a more proactive mode where we can be that strategic lever, that trusted advisor in our organization. So now let's talk a little bit about growth strategy. The interesting thing here is that there's all these different businesses across our economy. You've probably worked in a number of different businesses throughout your career. We're going to talk a little bit about how businesses grow and how that growth ends up breaking things, okay? So when we can start to see, okay, we're taking this kind of a strategy as an organization, well, then we can direct our efforts and direct our eyes toward the things that are likely going to break first. We can't do everything, okay? Unfortunately, we can't look under every single rock. We have to fish where the fish are at, and having a picture on where the business is going is going to help us, again, direct those limited resources that we have entrusted to our department toward the things that are really going to move the needle more than anything else. So these are really kind of the four ways that all businesses grow. They either grow organically, they grow through M&A, which is short for mergers and acquisitions, buying other companies, combining operations, buying other technologies. That's the second one. The third one is through partnerships and joint ventures. So maybe that's getting into a new market and creating a partnership or some kind of a joint venture where your products can be sold through those new relationships, or through geographic expansion. Maybe your organization only sold in the Southeast and now you're starting to expand up into the Northeast, or maybe you've only sold in America and now you're moving into Canada and to Mexico. So it's important for us to think about across these different, modes of growth, which most organizations have probably some kind of a mix, depending on where efforts are being placed and what bet the organization is making on what is going to drive their growth. We should have an eye toward that so that we can, assess those risks and, again, map our efforts towards the things that matter most from a business objectives perspective. So new products and markets create new regulatory gaps. The speed to market pressure means that compliance is often an afterthought. Growth is king, right? A CEO's bonus probably is going to show up in its stock price or the stock options that they end up getting, which is ultimately going to be driven by the growth of the organization. So when that is paramount and we have to try to reduce the risk that we're playing catch up and kind of chasing behind the car speeding down the road. You all have probably been part of mergers and acquisitions. You've been part of M&A. Ideally, before that kicks off, we're going to talk about that on the next slide, but often after the fact where you're like, oh my gosh, what did we buy? So sometimes we acquire a company and we're ultimately acquiring the whole company. If it's just the assets or the entire assets and liabilities, there's things that come along with that. You're inheriting their compliance problems. So due diligence gaps or due diligence that is not done because, let's say, compliance is not involved, ends up getting done after the fact when you kind of finally crawl in the crawl space or open up the attic, so to speak, and you find a bunch of garbage in there. That can many times lead to multi-million-dollar surprises in the remediation of those issues that, frankly, had they been found earlier, could have been pulled forward in that asset purchase agreement discussion to lower the purchase price of the organization. M&A risks end up being showing up and essentially overpaying for an organization because the acquirer or the buyer has not properly priced that business because there's more risks often than they saw, right? So partnerships and JVs, sometimes there's sometimes the shared liability comes with misaligned controls. So we need to understand our partners' compliance failures or their compliance programs so we can anticipate what potential failures might be coming down the road to prevent any enforcement actions that we're going to have to deal with. Like everything in life, it's like the more work we can pull forward, the more we can see around the curve, the more proactive we can be, and the less sort of anxiety and cortisol ends up plaguing our bodies when we're dealing with a fire that could have been put out when it was just a little bit of smoke, okay? And then geographic expansion, obviously, if you've ever been part of expanding to a new country or to a new region, you've seen how these new laws in these new jurisdictions can create new challenges, new regulators to deal with, new expectations for your program, let alone how we end up interacting with these new cultures and those cultural norms that we have to navigate. So there's often a time bomb with M&A with respect to compliance. So we have due diligence gaps. We have many times we're inheriting violations if those haven't been checked kind of during that due diligence phase prior to the purchase agreement being signed. There's often integration challenges and they're post-close surprises. So we want to try to uncover more of these things early so that we're not dealing with a ticking time bomb that's going to kind of explode in our face, and then we're doing all this remediation and all this cleanup. So when we are the last one to the table, when we're not involved in that due diligence process at all, that can lead to a lot of these due diligence gaps. Listen, a private equity person might not know all the compliance questions to ask, okay? Even somebody who's doing the legal diligence, that's often outsourced to an outside counsel who's helping to oversee that legal diligence. They don't know all the intricacies necessarily of your compliance program or the types of challenges that you, if you had eyes on it, might kind of uncover. Successor liability means that if those liabilities move over into the deal, those problems of the target company are now your problems to clean up. Merging two companies' compliance programs is often very difficult, just like merging all these other things, right? Merging finance, merging marketing, merging sales. There's challenges in all those things, but there's a very particular type of challenge that comes in merging two compliance programs. Everybody puts their own English on the ball, and everybody doesn't have the same level of compliance program quality. So when we can get in front of these things, we can start to kind of minimize some of these post-close surprises as opposed to finding out about something 6 or 12 months down the road. Let's talk a little bit about geographic expansion traps. This could be an entire hour-long episode, so I don't want to spend too long on it. But when we're coming into new jurisdictions, it's important for us to understand what are the new regulatory frameworks that we're going to have to comply with. What are the cultural differences, which I alluded to a couple of slides ago. Some organizations or some regions, what they consider a gift, we would absolutely consider a bribe. Those are things that are maybe normal course of business in one area that are actual violations on our side. These are things that we have to account for if we're going to have a smooth transition and be able to achieve the growth projections that come along with the expansion into this new market. Local requirements. This is something that often doesn't get thought about, definitely during the expansion, planning phase. But you end up kind of thinking about after the fact, where it's like, okay, I have to localize all of this data. I have to translate all of these forms. I have to translate all of these, program elements that need to apply to this new jurisdiction. These are all things that can end up kind of making an integration not go as quickly or as smoothly as we would like. So again, we want to try to pull forward as much of that work as possible. The compliance team must be involved before the expansion decision, not after the office lease is signed in this other country. So let's talk about reading the company's playbook and how we can extract compliance intelligence to, again, inform our program and how we end up attacking things. I got to go a little faster here, okay? So where can you find your strategy? The best place to find it, there's a bunch of great things here: board decks, executive calls, earnings calls if you're at a public company. The best place to find it, though, is to talk to executives or leaders inside the organization. You're probably going to get a less filtered view of the strategy of the business. And, the CEO is probably talking about things at an all hands. There's probably investor presentations that if you can get your eyes on, those are going to be informative to you. But the point is, there's a bunch of rocks to look under to find out what the organization's strategy is. And we want to make sure that we're not just going after the stated strategy, but what is the actual strategy? Sometimes there's a bit of a gap there that's difficult to uncover if you're just relegating your exposure to the strategy to some of these published documents. So what you want to look for in these earnings calls or in these strategy decks or these investor presentations or in the conversations that you're having with leaders throughout the organization. Listen, these are easy conversations to have. If you go to your leadership, whether it's CEO or CFO or whoever, and you say, hey, I want to make sure that what I'm doing is tying into the business objectives. I have a couple of strategies on where the business is going this year and where you think it might be going over the next few years. I want to make sure the things I'm doing are helping our business achieve these things in a more, efficient and effective way. Who's not going to want to have that conversation, okay? So these are a couple of things that you want to listen for as you're having those conversations and as you're checking these kinds of sources. What are new markets we're thinking of entering? Are we pursuing an M&A strategy? And if so, what kind of targets are we going after? most likely you're probably going to be buying companies that are smaller. If they're in a separate industry, that's one thing that you might need to get smart on. If it's the same industry, there's probably some pattern recognition that you could apply, and there's probably some easily identifiable gaps in those smaller companies' compliance programs relative to your mothership program that you're going to be able to look out for. Are there new product launches coming? Are there compliance considerations around those things that, again, the sooner we can start bringing those things up, the better the impact can be. Cost reduction initiatives. There's a lot of cost reduction initiatives going on across our organization. It's our job, because we are the content or the context, mavens within our organization, because we touch so many different departments, often at a level of detail or with an understanding of nuance beyond that which doesn't make its way to the ivory tower where a lot of these strategies are coming up. We can usually help our organization see around the curve if we're applying that pattern recognition or applying that context that we uniquely have, okay? And then think about reorganizations. Like the cost-cutting thing always has, you guys have all dealt with this before, there's always downstream implications to those cost-cutting decisions that are often made just on a spreadsheet without, consideration for that nuance. And then reorganizations. What are the structural changes that are likely to come from making these reorg changes? If you can start to listen for those things, your compliance mind is naturally going to start to integrate how these different elements should be kind of woven into or folded into your next 6-month or your next 12-month compliance program. We just need to know how to listen, because again, every day is different in business, right? What got us here is not going to get us there. There's new technologies, there's new risks ripping across our organizations, and it's our job, it's our responsibility to help be the Sherpa for our business as they're climbing this mountain of risk towards that North Star, towards that vision, to do that in the most efficient way possible, okay? So let's talk about how we can now get strategic with our compliance plan. How can we align our compliance plan to the business objectives? That's really the whole statement for this thing. So we came up with a template here. This is probably going to look very different, but the principle here is what I want to try to convey. So if you can map your company's objectives, listen, there's an 80-20 rule with everything. I say this in every episode, but it's like how I view the entire world. There's a ton of objectives across the business, okay? There's a ton of objectives that are changing all the time. You can't focus on everything, but if you can focus on some of those main ones that are likely to have the biggest impact on your business's operations and start to map those objectives to the compliance implication, if we do this, if we enter the Asian market, or if we launch a new product, or if we acquire a competitor, what are some of the likely compliance implications? Then we can lead to an action. So building a little spreadsheet like this, where we're talking about the objective, the ensuing compliance implication that is going to perhaps or likely come out of that objective, we can start to sketch out what actions we might want to take in order to, again, mitigate those risks or keep that, car driving on the highway, not careening off, into the ravine. Bonus points. And this is probably a best practice, and you should definitely be thinking about this. How can we quantify this? How can we put a metric to these actions to ensure that the bets we're making or the efforts that we're placing are actually moving the needles that we would expect them to move? So think about this strategic alignment template. We have a great infographic that our marketing team put together that is going to be shared in the chat if it hasn't already. I'm going fast here, so I can't keep up with all these comments, but please do keep them coming. Joe is dropping some in the chat here. I got to come to those in a second. Okay, thanks for that, Joe. I'll get to that in a sec. Okay, so now let's start thinking about how we can use this kind of a template and how we can use this new sort of posture or this new way of interacting with our business to build our strategic compliance plan. Okay, so we want to map, like I was just saying, we want to map every strategitic objective. What are the strategic objectives of the organization? Then we want to start to prioritize the impact. Focus on the risks that are going to derail strategy. If somebody is moving into a new market that they haven't foreseen a language barrier, or they haven't foreseen a way of doing business that is likely going to result in a much higher cost, whether that's higher actual dollars or higher costs in terms of not being able to achieve those projected numbers, we want to try to prioritize the things, as always, that are going to have the biggest impact. And then we want to overlay on those certain metrics that are going to matter. So what are the compliance KPIs that are tied to the business outcomes, not just the activity? We don't just want to measure activity. We want to try to always listen, all we can control are our activities, of course, but we want to make sure that these activities are leading to the outcome. So we need some eye on some kind of a metric that's downstream, that's a function of these activities being done successfully, to ensure that we're not just putting one foot after the other and just sort of running in place. So your plan, your compliance plan, the plan for your program should be changing all the time. You should build in margin to make those kinds of changes as new challenges come or as new strategies are rolled out across the organization. And they should always tie to the strategic plan of the business. Every objective, every risk, every action, the higher overlap you can have between the initiatives or the actions you are taking with the objectives and strategic initiatives of the organization, the easier it is to make the case that you are rowing in the same direction, on the same team, adding value to the business. Stack those things up over time. It becomes way easier to get brought into these strategy conversations earlier, okay? So if your plan doesn't reference the company's strategic plan, it's just really a checklist, okay? We want to be, we're never going to be a strategic lever in the business unless we're actually a lever, okay? Unless we're actually, what is a lever? It's something that with a little bit of effort can have a lot of output. That's what we want to be in the business. And it takes us applying our unique perspective, our unique context in line with the business objectives to turn those light bulbs on at the top, okay? So let's talk about compliance at the strategy table. We are going to dive into a case study here. We're going to dive into a little case study here. We're going to talk about two acquisitions. I'm not going to name the companies. You can probably do a little research and figure out what these are, but this kind of helps illustrate the benefit of getting involved early versus the late discovery. So company A, compliance was part of the acquisition process. They were part of that due diligence process to some degree. They identified some pre-closing risks during due diligence. There was a purchase price adjustment that ended up reflecting that compliance exposure. The integration plan ended up including some of these compliance work streams from day one. This was not something that had been stapled on day 90 when the thing finally popped out. And the board was informed of that risk profile before the vote. For the company that I'm referencing here, the compliance person that was a part of this was then there was a bunch of acquisitions that came down the road. She was brought into every single acquisition because the business is a pattern recognition machine. Those people are pattern recognition machines, right? Those leaders. And they saw, oh man, we got to get so-and-so into this early to make sure that that thing that we avoided, we're able to avoid on all these other acquisitions. Company B, this is maybe a little bit more of what's common. Compliance was not brought into that due diligence process. And what happened? There was an FCPA violation discovered post-close that led to a massive amount of remediation costs. The CEO was totally blindsided by this inquiry, and that resulted in a massive drop in the company's stock. So these are kind of anecdotal, but you can see the sooner we can get involved, the sooner we can sort of bless the transaction or at least help see around the curve, like, okay, well, when we absorb this, there's a bunch of stuff that we're going to have to do. The earlier we can start to plan, the better, the higher the likelihood that the plan ends up getting executed. And we're spending our time on the right thing. So the difference here between company A and company B was not just the capabilities of the compliance team. It was really about the proximity of that compliance team to the strategy conversation, the proximity to the decision, their ability to intersect with that diligence process, which obviously is an execution of strategy, right? If they're buying companies or whatever, that intersection or that closer proximity led to much higher downstream enterprise value creation, okay? So the point is where the compliance sits matters. And there's implicit and explicit kind of way to have this conversation. Let's just walk through kind of these different configurations for a compliance department. We're kind of tying now down to how does the compliance team execute its strategy, again, in light of those business objectives. So the most common thing is, right, the chief compliance officer is part of legal. That's common, but it's limited, okay? So sometimes many times compliance is viewed as sort of a sub-legal function, and that ends up kind of reducing some of our strategic influence. The next layer up, this is, so let's say that one is kind of basic status quo. Good is when CEO has a direct line to or chief compliance officer or the compliance department has a direct line to the CEO and maybe a dotted line to the board. Okay, this gives us some direct access to the top and some visibility for escalations to the board. The best and the strongest is where the chief compliance officer or that compliance department has a direct line directly to the board. This is the maximum independence, but this requires a really strong relationship with the CEO in order for them to feel comfortable turning that dotted line into a solid line. So DOJ data, as you guys have known, and we've talked about on various different episodes here, DOJ data shows that programs with independent chief compliance officers are 3 times more likely to receive cooperation credit. So that's a great safety net, right? That's a great sort of backup parachute. But I think where the real value comes is in a higher visibility to the strategic direction of the organization and a closer proximity to those decision points that are ultimately going to lead to something that needs to get cleaned up, right? Like nothing, newsflash, nobody knows what they're doing, okay? Everyone's just kind of doing things. Everybody comes up with a plan and they try to do something, and sometimes it goes right and sometimes it goes wrong. We all know this. We've all kind of lived through it. The closer, again, we can get to those decisions, the more likely we are to apply our pattern recognition and see what might be coming down the pike. So the independence imperative, DOJ evaluation talks about whether chief compliance officer has genuine independence. Do they have the ability to escalate? Do they have the right unrestricted access to information in the organization, to records, to personnel? And is the compliance program directly resourced? So these are things to kind of think about and talk about with your CEO or with your leadership to, again, make the case for more independence. And again, color within the lines that are conveyed from DOJ about the guidance that, the criteria they apply to what a strong program is. Again, we want to get more access and closer proximity to these decisions that are being made, okay? So let's talk about this, my new favorite thing here, which is the so what framework. I'm really trying to embed this in the mind of my kids. We should always be able to answer the so what test. So these are 4 questions that you need to kind of think about, or 3 questions you need to think about, okay? One is the strategic objective, like what strategic objective does this thing that we're talking about support? If you can't name one, the initiative might not be a priority, okay? Number 2 is what risk does this reduce? Bonus points if you can quantify this in dollars. Make some assumptions. Get comfortable making some assumptions. Get comfortable applying some kind of an expected value to come up with that calculation. Quantify that exposure so that regulators and the board can start to think about things, they naturally think in financial terms. Adopt that kind of a framework so you can speak their language in a better way. Then think about what happens if we don't do it. Try to get out of the binary black and white thinking and apply, again, this expected value framework. What is the expected value? Yes, when you get in your car, you can get into a car accident. What's the expected value of that? What is the likelihood of that thing happening? The bad thing that can happen should always be weighed against the likelihood of that happening. If there's no real effective consequence once that expected value is applied, or the expected likelihood of that thing happening is applied, well, that should knock the urgency of the particular initiative down, okay? So if you can't answer all 3, you should really consider reconsidering that initiative, okay? So let's applying the framework. Here's a couple examples. I'll maybe just do one of each. So an anti-bribery training for teams entering a new Asia market, that directly supports our geographic expansion strategy. Check. That's a great initiative. Something like a policy update for a regulation that doesn't really apply to any active business lines, that's probably something that's a checkbox initiative that can probably be deprioritized. So again, when we can weigh our initiatives and kind of gut check them against the strategic objectives of the organization and apply this kind of so what framework, it can really help us inform our plan and build a plan that's actually going to be impactful, right? We don't want to waste our time doing stuff. We don't want to live out a check the box kind of function. How are we doing on time here? We're doing pretty good. Okay. I got a little bit ahead of time here, so that's great. I got a couple of great questions here. So let me pause real quick here. Susan asked, I'm afraid in spite of management intentions, our corporate strategy has become a platitude. I am interested in strategies for the strategy to keep the focus on the path up the mountain. So this is a great thing. Thank you for bringing this up, Susan. This is great. There's always some strategy going on though, right? So if the strategy is really a platitude to appease an investor or to appease the board and something else is going on, you have to kind of bet. You have to make a bet on what game are you trying to play? If you're not going to be able to really influence and mobilize the organization toward, turning this platitude into a reality, the question is, do you want to stay in the company or do you want to leave the company? If you want to stay in the company, well, then there's probably a different game that you want to play. There's probably a game of incrementalism or continuous improvement that you can do to make your corner of the world a little bit better, right? But I'm just saying, regardless of if the explicit strategy is a platitude and that's not the real strategy, well, then what is the real strategy? Well, then help that thing, okay? Assuming that that's not something nefarious. But this is a big challenge, and this happens a lot in organizations of all sizes, whether it's a small organization that is, the CEO has taken his eye off the ball, or maybe he's not as engaged as he once was, or the company has sort of lost its way and they're still kind of, putting out these kind of platitudes. These things happen all the time. Susan went on to say, Wondering if there is a good form of due diligence checklist for compliance professionals to start with and further customize for the specific industry. Yeah, that's a great question. I wonder if we could put something together. I mean, kind of the problem is always that a baseline checklist might just be a little bit more kind of, unless it's kind of principle based, it really needs to be probably built for your business, your regulation, and that, the regulations that you're subject to, and the actual kind of strategic question, in hand. So that's something that like we can think about a little bit, but I just think start with something. Like if you just started with a blank piece of paper and listed out 5 or 6 things that if you were, able to be part of that diligence process, there's probably a few things that are going to come to mind. And if you can make the case to get involved, there's probably a couple of things else that, it's like when you go to the store, you start kind of browsing around and you start seeing other things. You're probably going to see other things. I think the first move is really to get into that process, increase your proximity to that whole kind of pre-purchase process, that pre-kind of acquisition process. And happy to kind of brainstorm that offline, Susan, if you want to reach out. Okay. I'm going to keep moving here. We got about 15 minutes left. Anything else in the chat here? I'm sorry, there's so many great comments. I wish I could read them all, but love you all. Okay. All right, let's keep moving. Okay, so let's talk about positioning as a strategic partner. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. We talk about that all the time. Beauty absolutely is in the eye of the beholder, and your position as a strategic partner also exists in the eye of the beholders, if that's the plural. Okay, so how can we better show up and position ourselves as this strategic partner? How can we start to apply some of these principles that we've been talking about? We talked about vision and mission and values. We talked about Porter's 5 forces. We talked about how businesses grow. And we talked about applying seeing what kind of risks come out across these different strategies. Then we talked about making sure that our program is tied out to the strategic objectives of the organization and quantifying those things. And then we talked about how we can kind of uncover, or I guess a little bit before that, we talked about how we can kind of uncover what these actual strategies, stated strategies are. As Susan said, we also have to kind of weigh those stated strategies against what is actually going on in the business, okay? For some reason, when a CEO says something, everybody doesn't just sort of fall in line and do those things. So there's always a gap between that aspirational, thank you very much. Okay, finally. Okay, so there's 5 tactical moves I think are really smart to help you get in the mood, get in the room. Okay. 1 is attend business unit meetings. 2 is to present things in the business language. 3 is to volunteer for cross-functional projects. That gives you a lot of exposure. 4 is to share industry intelligence proactively. And 5 is to build one-on-one relationships with leaders. Let's go through these quickly because I don't want to pave over these. These are really where the rubber meets the road. This is where these concepts we've been talking about really can kind of be brought down to earth and can be sort of tactically applied regardless of your situation. So attending business unit meetings, go and be a fly on the wall. Like I learned so much just attending board meetings back in my private equity days. I wasn't talking, if you can imagine that, okay? I was just sitting there listening, but it gave me a lot of insights on how decisions were made. You should go there to listen, not to audit. Learn from the language, learn from the pressures, learn and see kind of what the power dynamics are in those meetings. And you can start to kind of read between the lines between what's stated and what's actually getting done. 2 is to present things in the business's language. Many times in compliance, we kind of speak and should, or we point to a regulation or something like that. Nobody at the executive level is really thinking in that. Like I was saying a couple of slides ago, they're thinking in dollar terms. So the better we're able to quantify things, the better we're able to turn an anecdote into something that's objective and apply a little bit of logos. A dollar sign around that logos is where to get some real bonus points. Talk about revenue, talk about margin, talk about speed. That's the language of business. So when we're talking about our regulation, our regulatory findings, and all those kinds of things, translate that into something that's easier for them to hear. And then you start to show up as a real business person. Remember when we had Ross Ronan on, in the past, he talked about the greatest compliment he ever got was when his CEO said to him, and this guy is like a genius, compliance executive, okay? And his CEO said, I never really think of you as a compliance person. I always think of you as a business person first. Phenomenal. Well, guess what he did? He was always talking about the language of the business. He was always instinctively connecting his efforts toward the objectives of the organization. That makes it very easy to show that you're wearing the same jersey as everybody else in the business, okay? Volunteering for cross-functional projects is such a hack. Listen, nobody has time for anything. I get it. But if you can just do a little bit of that, it allows you to have interaction points, intersection points with other people in the business. It gives you more context for that you can run through the compliance lens that you have built, and it gives you a much better perspective on how to actually apply the what the business should do to a plan that is going to actually help them get those things done. Okay, so this helps to also lead to I'll get to 5 in a second. This industry intelligence proactively, your ability to share that is also a ton of influence that a lot of us end up leaving on the table. If you're dialed into what's going on in the industry from a DOJ perspective or from a regulatory framework perspective, or you're reading Radical Compliance every week and you're hearing what's going on, there's usually information that's going to hit your radar before it hits your boss's radar or your CEO's radar. Incorporate that and kind of take advantage of the information asymmetry that you uniquely have in compliance. That can do a lot. Listen, people do things for 3 reasons. We talk about this all the time. We talk about that motivation triad. They do things to avoid pain. They do things to increase efficiency, or they do things to increase pleasure. Increasing pleasure is like kicking more ass. So if you can be a resource that is going to help the organization kick more ass, or help the boss, the CEO, achieve his initiatives in a more meaningful, more effective, more efficient way, well, then they're naturally going to pull you into that thing. We want to try to, that's really the basis of us getting in the room. When we can show ourselves to be helpful, when we can show ourselves to be useful, you get just pulled into those things, like my friend from Company A during that earlier case study. And then finally, building these one-on-one relationships with business leaders. We had Mel and we had Lori and we had Matt Kelly on a recent, Ethicsverse. I just wrote an article about it today. And they were talking about the value that comes from building those relationships. When they only see us when something is going wrong, well, they start to associate us with things that go wrong, okay? When they associate us with being helpful, being useful, being a listening ear, building that human-to-human connection, the odds of us getting invited in are extremely high. Because guess what? I haven't talked to anybody in compliance who doesn't care, who's not smart, who's not trying to leave the world better, right? Like, that is what our heart is. What we have to do, and I think what our industry has sort of failed at, there I said it, over the last kind of 2 decades, is creating the circumstances for us to exhibit that usefulness and that kind of impact. So you have to, listen, your job is to bend the world to your will, create opportunities for yourself to show these unique qualities that you have accumulated, this heart that you have in your chest and this brain you have in your head, to the problems of the business, and watch your career really accelerate forward. So these are some of the things that compliance partners, okay, people that are a part of the business, not apart from the business, do a little bit differently. They have a little bit more of the proportion of their time spent in proactive versus reactive mode. They're focusing on solutions, not just the problems. They're coming with ideas. They're not just pointing out what's going wrong, but they're coming up with ideas on how to fix those kinds of things. They speak in business language, not ethereal, amorphous legal language. There's an actionability to the things that they're talking about that doesn't need 5 steps to translate. Speak in dollars, speak in speed, speak in margin. Those are the things, those are the kind of essence of what business language is. And they're not just regulation aware, they're revenue aware. The business cares most about revenue, okay? That's the bottom line, okay? Well, I guess that's the top line. But of course, they care about regulations, but that is a function of the pursuit of their care around revenue, okay? So when we can understand that our adversaries, or the people that we're trying to influence, or the people that we're trying to work with, have maybe a different prioritization, and we can kind of step into that frame, it's so much easier to communicate and to resonate with them. All right, let's keep moving. We got about 10 minutes left here. So the compliance teams, I've seen this throughout my career now. The compliance teams that get invited into the strategy meetings are the ones that have earned that invitation. It's not because, hey, we really should have compliance here. I don't want to rely on should. I want to rely on, hey, hold on, we can't have this meeting without compliance. We got to get so-and-so in here because I don't want to deal with a problem down the road. That's the ideal. That's what we should be striving for. And that's always rooted in being useful before we're needed. From showing our value before showing our value in fire prevention, as opposed to showing our value in being able to put out a fire, okay? So we got a couple of minutes left. I got a case study here that's gonna help us pull all of this stuff together. So we're talking about Apex Health. This is their Q3 earnings call. And these are some of the things that the CEO said. I'm gonna read through those things, and then I'm gonna talk about what compliance should hear from these things, okay? No peeking. We're excited to close on the MedRecord acquisition by year end, a $340 million deal that is going to double our footprint. Our EU and Brazil launches are on track for Q1 of next year, or from Q1 of this year, and we're hitting sales leadership, or we're hiring sales leadership in both of those regions now. We're embedding AI clinical decision support across the platform. This is our biggest product bet for the decade. And we're targeting a 15% G&A reduction, that's general and administrative cost reduction next year through automation and shared services. So again, this is what the CEO is saying to Wall Street. This is what he's saying out to the investors. When we polish our compliance ears, what should we be hearing here? Okay, well, we have some successor liability issues, perhaps HIPAA exposure, prior period billing audits, unknown OCR investigations. There's perhaps a GDPR or LGPD issue that we might need to look into. So some things maybe about data residency, some sales incentive bribery risk in these new markets that maybe have a different culture around bribes and things like that. How about clinical validation, algorithmic bias audits for our big AI bet? That's what our compliance ear should tune into, this big AI clinical decision support and be thinking about these risks, these adverse event reporting, okay? And then finally, what kind of control degradation might come from this 15% reduction in costs across our general and administrative sort of fixed costs on our P&L? These costs, or these cuts, often hit monitoring first, training, audit adjacent functions first. These are the things that are most vulnerable. So which of the controls that are overseen by these people that might not be on the CFO's, radar, or the CEO's radar? He's trying to hit his earning target so he can get his, stock options vested or whatever. What are the things that are maybe unforeseen when that decision is made at that level? Okay. So let's talk now about what the strategic risk map is, or how that may have changed as a result of that strategic statement during that CEO's the Q3 earnings call. Okay. So let's talk about the first thing you mentioned was the med record acquisition. So this is critical. This is one of those, going back to how we're, where these risks can come. They can come from our expansion. They can come from cost cutting, things like that. This is an M&A risk. So successor liability, like I said on the last one, and think about those enforcement actions that might be discovered post-close. The window for this is like now, okay? So if we can get involved with that pre-close due diligence, because these regions that we're expanding into through this M&A, I'm jumping around a little bit, pre-close due diligence. The EU and the Brazil launch, this is a geographic expansion. This is not critical, but this is high, okay? So we're kind of giving this an orange or like a yellow type of a score here. So during the Q1 launch, right, we have a Q1 launch coming up for these expansions into EU and Brazil. We want to make sure that we have our eye on data residency rules. We have our eye on LGPD and GDPR rules. What are the kind of intersections of those regulations with our new operations there? And do we have any anti-bribery exposure that we can get out ahead of through training or through controls that we can put on these new sales channels? The AI clinical decision support, okay, this is something else that's high. This is a big bet, he said, that's coming out, this year. So our FDA, SAMD, okay, SAMMD, classification, EU AI Act, high-risk system obligations, especially if this AI clinical decision support is going to be sold in this new region that we're expanding into, or that we're launching in Q1. Those are some system obligations that we're going to make sure that we have dialed in. So we're again not playing catch up, and having some kind of documentation, particularly under the EU AI Act, around algorithmic bias. If we're just staying in the United States, we don't have that regulation, at least not to the degree they have in the EU. And then finally, a medium risk driven by these cost initiatives is this 15% general and administrative cost reduction, okay? So again, we talked about the controlled degradation risk. Monitoring, training, and audit, like we said, are the first ones to get hit. Where are these cuts going to come? What controls are residing in the people or in the departments that are likely going to be cut, and how can those be passed to somebody else, or how can those be automated in a way to where, we don't just have a bunch of, smoke detectors going off because the batteries are dead, okay? So how can we then take this information and apply this to our strategic compliance plan? So again, this is just using that template that I shared, earlier on in the presentation. What's the strategic objective. We outlined 4 of those. What are the compliance implications? We went over those on the last screen. What are the actions we're going to take? Okay, so now we've tied out our actions to each one of these implications, and we've come up with some kind of an owner or some kind of a metric. When we can attack changes in business strategy or execution of the organization's objectives to these kinds of metrics, and those metrics are a result of actions that are a function of the compliance risks that are coming out of those objectives, we can ensure that our time is spent in things that are actually going to move the needle and that are actually going to add value to the organization. Okay, nobody's paying you to have a dead document on the shelf. They're paying for you to reduce the risk in the organization. So this is kind of the framework that can really help us to do that and ensure that we're doing that in the right way and that those needles are moving correctly here. Okay, I got like 1 minute left. So here is the so what application. Okay, I'm gonna go 2 minutes long. Okay, so here is the so what test on the med records deal. Remember, we went through that so what, those 3 questions. What's the strategic objective that does this support? Okay, so sorry. The initiative is to stand up a pre-close compliance due diligence on the med records acquisition. So what strategic objective does this support? Well, we're doubling the footprint via this $340 million med records deal, the CEO's headline, C4 commitment to Wall Street. What risk does this initiative reduce in dollars? Well, the industry-specific risks, the industry benchmark is undiscovered HIPAA billing exposure averages 6 to 12% of deal value. So on a $340 million deal, that's $20 to $40 million of unfunded liability that we can either price into the deal or we can eat post-close if in fact that gets validated. But again, bringing that asymmetric information, you think the CEO knows what, unfunded, HIPAA billing exposure, it averages 6 to 12%. He might, but it's on you to bring that forward to, again, pull that seat to the table, okay? So $20 to $40 million out of $340 million, those are all very big numbers. So what happens if we don't? Well, if we inherit violations that surface 6 to 12 months down the road, the CEO could be blindsided from an inquiry. The board can lose trust in the deal team or the execution team. And so we want to, the integration timeline is going to slip. Ultimately, the cost of the deal is significantly higher than it would otherwise be. So our initiative to trying to stand up some due diligence during that, pre-purchase process, right? That pre-acquisition process passes all 3. So this is the exact kind of initiative that compliance should be fighting to lead. Again, we've weighted it. We've spoken in the business terms. We've connected it to the business objectives. We've quantified it in terms that people care about. And we can put some dollars around that downside scenario. How much more powerful is something like this than saying, well, I really should be part of this? And they're like, I'm trying to get this deal done, so you can deal with it after. I mean, we've all felt that. We've all had that conversation in an M&A scenario. Okay, so let's think about, I'm wrapping it up here. I want to just talk about this mindset shift from this regulatory checkpoint to a strategic navigator for the business. Thank you guys all for your participation in this. I hope you guys continue to see value in this. Please provide feedback. Please share with your friends. We want to make sure that the hours that you spend on the Ethicsverse are extremely valuable to you. And we're always working to get better, okay? So before, we're kind of this regulatory checkpoint that the business has to pass through. After, we are turning into a strategic navigator, a strategic lever in the business that really helps the business move faster and uncover unforeseen costs before they rear their ugly head, okay? So the best compliance officers don't wait to be consulted. They insert themselves into the conversations before the risk materializes. They've changed their proximity to those decisions. So for this week's exercise, I want you to map your compliance plan to the strategy. There's probably a bunch of stuff on the plan that you might have a hard time mapping to the business's strategy. Some of those things are compulsory, perhaps. There's probably some other things on there that maybe you just did last year, or maybe you've always done it, or maybe you inherited a program that they've just always kind of done things that way. Bring those beginner's eyes to your program or to your plan and see what things you can change. It's on you to make bets with your time. It's on you to grab the steering wheel of your life, or the steering wheel of your career, or the steering wheel of your program, and drive your program to where it needs to go. Nobody knows better than you on where things need to go and what needs to happen. With this kind of a framework, this really helps you make more well-informed decisions about changes that might need to be made to your program. Okay, so get a copy of the strategic plan, have a conversation with the CFO or the CEO, listen to a recent all hands meeting if there's a recording of that. Even better if it's a public company, listen to your recent earnings call from the last quarter or from your annual report, and start to map those compliance plans against those business objective plans. For every strategic objective, if there is a compliance implication from the execution of that objective, you should have something on your plan that helps to compensate for that. That's going to help to be a guardrail around, that bend in the road. Okay. So ask, does my compliance program address these things? Do I have some kind of a safety net around it? Do I have some kind of a guardrail around this new strategic objective that maybe wasn't on your radar? Okay. Start to identify those gaps. Where is the strategy moving faster than compliance can follow? Listen, we always see this, right? We're seeing this with AI, where the regulation around AI is not moving as fast as the technology. What does that create for you? Well, that creates a lot of anxiety. That creates a lot of waste. It creates a lot of dead weight loss at the end of the day. We can't apply that same thing that we're a victim of to our own organization. We need to kind of change the posture and change those sort of those vectors of intersection with the business. And we need to start to kind of fill those gaps in real time. So if you can come to the next session, as we're going through our announcements, I'd like you guys to share what you found, because there's probably going to be some light bulb moments if you take 15 to 30 minutes to go through this exercise. All right. So the questions to guide your mapping, I promise I'm going to wrap up. I'm sorry I'm 4 minutes long. I just can't shut up today. Okay. I didn't even take a sip of coffee, if you can believe it. Okay. Which strategic objectives have no compliance coverage? Which compliance initiatives don't connect to any strategic objective? And where is the company growing fastest? Is compliance keeping pace? Is the new expansion to the new region growing too fast? Is the acquisition strategy accelerating at a rate beyond which you even know about, or you continually find out about new acquisitions after the ink is dry on the purchase agreement? These are the places that you want to kind of guide your mapping. So here are your key takeaways from Ethicsverse MBA session number 3. Strategy execution always creates compliance risk. If you're not at the strategy table, you're always going to be playing catch up. Okay. Number 2, every compliance initiative should pass the so what test. If you can't answer the so what test, then that is something that you should consider reconsidering the importance of. 3, getting invited to the room isn't about demanding a seat. Okay. I don't want to be invited to a party by obligation. I want to be invited to a party because I'm so fun and I'm so charming. Okay. I want people to, but I only do that by proving that I should be there. Okay. So we have to not think and should, I should be at that meeting. That is a very low agency way to think about things. We want to think about, what can I exhibit? What behaviors can I exhibit? How can I help my organization? How can I be more useful? We talked about that throughout the session. If you can really double down on that and build those relationships, that's going to help ensure that you're going to be the belle of the ball. You're going to be invited to every single party. Okay. So next time we're talking about the revenue engine, we're going to be talking about sales, marketing, and what you're going to learn from where these pressure points really are, and why the sales team is both your biggest risk and your biggest ally. So there's a lot of opportunity in the revenue thing. We should be very intimate with how the sales and the marketing works, and what compliance risks come from that, and how we can better intersect with this massive engine of the organization. Join us on Thursday. We're going to be talking about high-risk investigations with the one and only Julio Rivera. And next Tuesday, we have an Ethico or an Ethicsverse University, where we are talking about something that's so interesting. My page is loading right now. You're not going to want to miss it. Oh, yeah. We're going to be talking about modern compliance training. You have to come to this. There's so much opportunity in the training. Okay. Love you all. Thanks for those of you who stayed long. We will see you Thursday. Take care.